Ethan Cole shut off the engine and the sound of the world seemed to collapse inward. Snow drifted across the windshield as the abandoned cattle ranch revealed itself slowly, like something summoned rather than found. The barn leaned under the weight of forgotten years, its roof sagging, its iron doors rusted shut. Fences lay broken and half buried in white, the house beyond them dark, silent, and slumped forward, as if it had grown tired of standing. A hollow cold settled deep in Ethan's chest. At 55, with aching joints and a life the world no longer seemed to need, this wasn't an inheritance. It felt like proof that even what was left to him was already dead. Then Ridge moved. The German Shepherd leapt from the truck, tail-high nose, sweeping the frozen ground with sudden urgency. He circled the barn, whined softly, pressed his paws against the porch, and looked back at Ethan with eyes burning with recognition, not fear, not confusion, certainty, as if this place, rotting, forgotten, dismissed by everyone, was calling them home. Why would a loyal service dog react like this to a ranch no one wanted? What could possibly be hidden beneath the silence, the snow, and the ruin? Before the answers change everything, take a moment to support this story by subscribing to the channel and staying with us until the end. Winter arrived in northern Minnesota like a verdict already decided, snow falling steadily under a low, iron-colored sky, the town muffled and narrowed by cold, as if the world itself had agreed to speak more quietly. Ethan Cole was 55 years old, an age that felt heavier than it looked. His body was still broad through the shoulders, thick with the muscle memory of decades of labor and military discipline, but time had etched its ledger across him in quieter ways, a permanent stiffness in his right knee from an old impact injury, a faint tremor in his hands when the cold cut deep, and a beard gone mostly gray that framed a face carved by wind, sun, and long nights without sleep. His jaw was square and stubborn, his nose slightly crooked from a break that had never been properly reset, and his eyes, steel blue, sharp but tired, carried the look of a man who had learned to measure rooms the moment he entered them, even when there was no longer any tactical reason to do so. In uniform, once people had stepped aside for him without thinking. Out here in a wool coat that had seen better winters and boots patched more times than he cared to admit, they barely looked at him at all. He lived in a rented room behind a shuttered bait shop at the edge of town, a place that smelled faintly of old wood bleach and river damp. It was cheap, warm enough if the heater cooperated, and close to the main road where employers sometimes posted handwritten notices promising work. The room held little: a narrow bed, a scarred wooden table, a chair with one leg reinforced by duct tape, and a single framed photograph of Ethan in his 40s, standing beside a younger German Shepherd under a foreign sky. The dog in the picture was gone now, buried somewhere Ethan never returned to, but the space beside him had not stayed empty for long. Ridge was 5 years old, a German Shepherd with a dense black and tan coat, dusted perpetually with snow this time of year, his fur thick around the chest and neck, thinning slightly along the muzzle where age had just begun to whisper. His ears stood tall and alert even at rest, and his amber eyes missed very little, especially when it came to Ethan. Ridge moved with the disciplined economy of a trained service dog, never wasting motion, never crowding, yet always close enough to be felt. He had a scar along his left flank, a pale line beneath the fur, and another just above the right foreleg. Souvenirs from work neither of them talked about. Ridge was not affectionate in the sloppy way people expected dogs to be. Instead, he leaned in at precise moments, rested his head against Ethan's knee when the man's breathing changed, and positioned himself between Ethan and doorways without being asked. He was not a pet so much as a presence, a quiet anchor keeping Ethan from drifting too far inward. Each morning Ethan rose before dawn, fed Ridge, pulled on layers, and walked into town through snow that creaked underfoot like brittle paper. He applied for work wherever the door was unlocked, warehouses smelling of oil and dust, trucking depots humming with engines, small security firms run by men half his age wearing pressed jackets and careful smiles. The conversations followed familiar grooves. They praised his reliability, nodded respectfully at his service record, asked about his age with apologetic tones, then gently, or sometimes not so gently, redirected him toward the exit. "We need someone faster," they would say. "The work's hard. You're overqualified. We're really looking for younger guys right now." Each phrase landed differently, but the message was the same. Ethan Cole belonged to an earlier draft of the world. Eventually, he accepted the only job that did not bother disguising its reasoning. A construction company hired him to clear scrap from demolition sites and shovel snow from lots no one wanted to deal with. The supervisor, a man named Carl Dempsey, in his late 30s with a ruddy face and permanently cracked lips, had looked Ethan up and down before handing him a shovel. "It's nothing fancy," Carl said, not unkindly. "Honestly, it's the kind of work we give to guys who aren't gonna complain. Older fellas usually stick with it." He had meant it as reassurance. Ethan heard it as a verdict. The shovel was heavy, the hours long, but it was not the labor that stung. It was the certainty in Carl's voice that this was where men like Ethan were placed when the world had finished with them. One late afternoon, as the light thinned and the wind sharpened, Ethan returned to his room to find a thick envelope waiting on the table, its edges slightly curled from the damp. The return address bore the name of a law office in Duluth, printed in formal black letters that immediately tightened something in his chest. Once, letters like that had meant deployments, changes, orders that rearranged a life overnight. Now they meant something quieter but no less final. Ridge watched as Ethan opened the envelope, his head tilted just enough to catch the shift in Ethan's breathing. The meeting took place 2 days later in a small office that smelled of old paper and burnt coffee. The attorney, a man named Harold Finnegan, was in his early 70s, thin to the point of fragility, with watery eyes behind thick glasses and hands that trembled slightly as he adjusted documents. He spoke carefully, as if every word weighed something. Finnegan explained that a distant relative, a man Ethan barely remembered from childhood visits and faded family stories, had passed away without direct heirs. The inheritance was simple, Finnegan said, almost apologetically, a long abandoned cattle ranch outside Durango, Colorado. No liquid assets, no investments, just land, an aging wooden house, and a series of structures that had once held livestock and now held nothing at all. Marlene Shaw had attended the meeting as well, sitting stiffly in a tailored coat that looked too light for the Minnesota cold. At 48, she carried herself with sharp efficiency, her posture straight, her blonde hair pulled into a tight knot at the nape of her neck. She was tall and slender, her features narrow and precise, and her skin bore the smooth pallor of someone who spent more time under fluorescent lights than under open skies. Marlene worked as an accountant in Denver, and it showed in the way she spoke. Everything was a calculation, every emotion measured against outcome. She had little patience for ambiguity and none at all for sentiment. As Finnegan finished, Marlene exhaled and shook her head. "Ethan, you can't keep that," she said, her voice brisk but not cruel. "It's a liability. You sell it, you get some money, you stabilize. That place will bleed you dry otherwise." Ethan did not argue. He stared at his hands, at the scars etched into his knuckles, at the way they shook slightly now that the room's warmth had begun to fade. Ridge lay at his feet, his body pressed against Ethan's boots, breath seeping through the leather like a reminder that not everything had left him yet. Finnegan slid a single iron key across the desk, old and worn smooth by decades of use. When Ethan picked it up, it felt heavier than it should have. That night, back in the rented room, the snow fell harder, the world reduced to a small circle of lamplight and the sound of Ridge's breathing. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, turning the key over into his palm, feeling the grooves carved by hands long gone. He had spent years being told what he could no longer do, what he was no longer suited for. The ranch, worthless on paper, pressed against him like a question he could not ignore. Ridge lifted his head and nudged Ethan's hand once, gently, insistently. For the first time in a long while, Ethan spoke without weighing the words first. "We'll go," he said quietly. "At least we'll see it." And in that small room with snow thick against the windows, and a dog who refused to look away, the idea of leaving stopped feeling like retreat and began almost imperceptibly to feel like movement. The drive took 2 days, stitched together by long highways, cheap gas stations, and the steady hush of winter pressing against the windshield. By day, the road unspooled across frozen plains and empty farmland, the sky wide and indifferent pale blue, washed thin by cold. By night, snow drifted into the cone of the headlights, turning the world into a narrow tunnel of white, each mile erased almost as soon as it passed beneath the tires. Ethan Cole drove his old pickup with both hands steady on the wheel, his posture rigid not from fear, but from habit, the same posture that had once carried him through far darker roads under far louder skies. Ridge sat in the passenger seat, his broad chest rising and falling slowly, sometimes sleeping, sometimes waking just long enough to place his head on Ethan's thigh when the man's grip tightened or his jaw set too hard. It was not affection so much as acknowledgement. The road was long, but they were not traveling alone. Ethan did not play music. Silence suited him better, gave his thoughts room to move without colliding. He thought of Minnesota receding behind him, of the narrow room, the shovel leaning by the door, Carl Dempsey's well-meaning voice. He thought of Marlene's face in the law office, the way concern and calculation shared space behind her eyes. Mostly he thought of the iron key in his pocket, its weight a constant reminder that this journey was not an escape, but a confrontation. Ridge sensed the quiet tension and remained alert, ears pivoting occasionally toward passing trucks, his gaze returning again and again to Ethan's face as if memorizing it under this different light. By the time Colorado rose around them, the landscape had changed its language. The air felt thinner, sharper, pine forests replaced bare fields, and the mountains clawed at the horizon, their peaks capped with snow that caught the fading sun. Late afternoon arrived suddenly, as it often did in winter, the light thinning from gold to gray in what felt like minutes. Ethan turned off the paved road onto a gravel track, marked only by a weathered sign leaning slightly to one side. Its paint chipped the name of the ranch, barely legible, beneath years of neglect. The truck rattled as it climbed stones, crunching beneath the tires, the engine working harder with each bend. The ranch appeared all at once, as if it had been waiting just beyond the trees. Ethan cut the engine, and the sudden silence pressed in, broken only by the wind moving through the pines and the faint creak of metal somewhere on the property. He stepped out, boots sinking slightly into snow-dusted earth, and took in the place that had been left to him as a legacy. The main barn loomed first, its roof sagging in the middle, like a tired spine rust blooming across the iron doors in jagged patterns that resembled old wounds. The cattle fences leaned at odd angles, some posts snapped, others held upright only by frozen soil and stubbornness. Tall weeds and wild grasses, dead but unbowed, reached toward his knees, their tops powdered with snow. Beyond it all sat the house, a 2-story wooden structure darkened by time, windows black and unreflective. Its porch slumped slightly forward as if weary of standing. Ethan stood still, hands in his coat pockets, breath fogging the air. A familiar hollow opened in his chest, the quiet voice he had learned to recognize over the years, whispering that this was proof, not opportunity. Proof that whatever he had once been useful for had passed, leaving him with ruins no one else wanted. The place looked less like a home and more like a marker, something left behind to say, This is where it ended. Then Ridge changed. The dog leapt down from the truck with a suddenness that startled Ethan, his paws disappearing briefly into the tall grass as he moved. Ridge's tail, usually carried in a calm, controlled arc, lifted high and began to wag with force, his entire body alive with energy that had not been there a moment before. His nose dropped to the ground, sweeping back and forth in tight, purposeful arcs, then lifted into the air as he sampled scents carried by the wind. He trotted toward the barn, inhaled deeply near the rusted doors, then circled the structure with a low, eager whine vibrating in his chest. This was not anxiety or excitement born of open space. This was recognition. Ethan watched his frown deepening. He had worked with Ridge long enough to know the difference between a dog enjoying freedom and a dog responding to something specific. "You know this place?" he asked quietly, the words sounding strange in the open air. Ridge did not answer, of course, but he ran toward the house next, planting his front paws on the lowest porch step and looking back over his shoulder. His amber eyes were bright intent, holding Ethan's gaze longer than usual. He glanced toward the tree line beyond the house, then back again, as if pointing without pointing, urging without barking. The light faded quickly after that. Shadows stretched across the yard, and the temperature dropped in a way Ethan felt immediately in his knee and fingers. He tested the porch with a cautious step, the wood groaning in response, and withdrew his foot. The house could wait. Experience had taught him the difference between bravery and foolishness. He retrieved his sleeping bag from the truck and prepared to spend the night where he was the cab offering at least a known quantity of safety. Ridge circled the truck once, then settled down near the driver's door, his body positioned so that he faced the barn and house simultaneously, a living alarm system that had not forgotten its purpose. The night was colder than Ethan expected. Wind threaded through gaps in the barn, producing long, low moans that might have unsettled someone else. To Ethan, they were simply unfamiliar sounds in a place that had not yet decided whether it wanted him. Snow fell steadily, flakes tapping softly against the truck's roof. Despite everything, he slept. Not deeply, but enough. Ridge's presence, solid and unwavering, anchored him in the way only another being who had stood watch before could. Morning came pale and sharp. The snow eased to a light fall, and the sky brightened to a brittle blue that made every surface glitter. Ethan stepped out of the truck, stretched slowly, and surveyed the ranch again in daylight. The decay was undeniable, but so was the scale. This was not a place meant for rest. It was a place that demanded effort, demanded hands, demanded a decision. He exhaled slowly, feeling something shift beneath the weight of fatigue and doubt. Retirement had never been part of his vocabulary. Neither had surrender. He began with the barn. The doors resisted him at first, hinges stiff with rust, but persistence won out, and they creaked open to reveal a cavernous interior, thick with the smell of old hay, dust, and iron. Sunlight pierced through gaps in the roof, illuminating floating moats that danced and vanished with each movement. Inside lay the remains of a working life, broken gates, cracked feed troughs, rusted machinery, half buried beneath tarps stiff with age. Ethan moved methodically, clearing a small area near the entrance, stacking salvageable wood, dragging debris into piles. His muscles protested, unused to sustained labor after months of shoveling and short shifts. But the pain was honest, purposeful. Ridge followed him closely, sometimes pausing to sniff an object with interest, before moving on, sometimes sitting to watch, as if memorizing the work. By midday, Ethan's gloves were dusted white, his breath coming harder. He took a break near the barn wall, water bottle in hand, and looked around. The place still looked like a grave, but graves he knew were meant for endings. This felt different. This felt unfinished. Ridge stood nearby, ears pricked, gaze fixed deeper into the barn, toward a darker corner Ethan had not yet reached. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the temperature dropped once more, Ethan secured the barn doors as best he could and returned to the truck. Exhaustion settled over him, heavy, but not crushing. He ate a simple meal, fed Ridge, and sat with the cab door open, watching the last light fade from the peaks. The ranch lay quiet, snow-softened, waiting. Ethan found himself thinking not of Marlene or Minnesota, but of the way Ridge had moved earlier, the certainty in the dog's body language. Dogs did not pretend. They responded. Before sleeping, Ethan walked the perimeter once more, memorizing distances, noting weak points in fences, cataloging the work ahead. It was an old habit, one that returned easily, like a language he had never truly forgotten. When he finally lay down, Ridge resumed his post beside the door, head up, listening. The ranch still looked like a grave in the half-light, but somewhere beneath the rot and rust, something else lingered. Ethan did not know what it was yet. He only knew he would not leave before understanding it. Snow fell in thin, deliberate sheets that afternoon, soft enough to muffle sound, but persistent enough to remind the land that winter was not finished yet. Ethan Cole worked the way he always had when his life depended on it, slowly, methodically breaking a problem into pieces small enough to survive. He rose before the light fully reached the valley, ate sparingly, layered his clothes with practiced efficiency, and stepped into the barn as if reporting for duty. There was no rush in him, no wasted movement. Each task was a checkpoint. Clear this corner, stack that beam, untangle the rusted wire without tearing your gloves. The body remembered what the mind tried to forget, how to endure, how to persist without drama. The cold bit into his joints, especially the knee that had never healed right, but the labor pushed blood back into places that had gone quiet. Sweat froze at the collar of his coat, then thawed again when he paused, a small discomfort he welcomed. Pain meant he was still participating. At night, when he crawled back into the truck and wrapped himself in the sleeping bag that smelled faintly of canvas and old soap, exhaustion came clean and honest. He slept the way soldiers slept when there was no immediate threat, shallow, alert, but untroubled by dreams. Ridge stayed close, never underfoot, never idle. The German shepherd moved through the barn with the same economy Ethan brought to his work. His black and tan coat gathered dust and bits of hay. His breath steamed softly in the cold air. Occasionally Ridge would disappear into a darker aisle of the barn and return moments later, carrying something in his mouth, a dropped work glove, stiff with age, a rusted wrench, once even a broken hammer handle. He placed these items near Ethan's feet, sat back and waited, ears forward as if awaiting further instruction. It was not play, it was logistics. Ethan found himself nodding at the dog more than once, a quiet acknowledgement between two beings who understood the language of usefulness. By the fourth day, the barn had begun to change its shape. Not dramatically, rot did not surrender that easily, but enough that pathways emerged where chaos had been. Sunlight reached farther into the interior, now revealing old brands burned into beams, the ghosts of cattle numbers, the history of work layered into the structure. Ethan had just finished dragging aside a collapsed section of fencing when he turned his attention to a massive piece of equipment half hidden beneath a canvas tarp near the back wall. The tarp was stiff, heavy with years of dust and grime. He braced, his foot heaved and tore it free in a coughing cloud that burned his throat and eyes. When the dust settled, the barn felt different, too quiet. Ridge was no longer at Ethan's side. Ethan straightened slowly, instinct sharpening. Ridge stood in the farthest corner of the barn, a place Ethan had not yet reached, where the light thinned and shadows gathered thickly along the floor. The dog was perfectly still. His ears were erect, his spine rigid, his head lowered until his nose hovered inches above the wooden planks. His tail did not wag. His chest barely moved. He was not hunting. He was not alarmed. He was focused in a way Ethan recognized immediately, a posture he had seen before under circumstances neither of them had spoken about since. "Ridge," Ethan called, keeping his voice level. The dog did not look back. He shifted his weight once, then lifted his right front paw and tapped the floor, twice. The sound was soft but unmistakable. Tap, tap. He paused, then repeated the motion with deliberate care. It was not scratching, it was not digging, it was a signal. Ethan felt a tightening behind his ribs, the old instincts waking without permission. He crouched and moved closer, careful not to startle the dog or break whatever concentration held him. Ridge finally looked up, then amber eyes locking onto Ethan's with an intensity that left no room for doubt. This was not curiosity. This was certainty. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured, more to steady himself than to ask a question. He ran his gloved hand over the planks where Ridge had indicated. The boards looked no different from the rest, weathered, scarred, darkened by decades of use. He pressed down with his palm, solid. He leaned his weight onto one knee, still solid. A rational man would have shrugged and moved on, blamed rodents or imagination. Ethan was not a rational man. He was a trained one. He studied Ridge's breathing, the set of his shoulders, the way the dog kept his nose aligned precisely with the seam between two boards. Ridge was not reacting to movement or sound. He was reacting to scent, faint, old, buried deep enough that only a nose like his could find it. And not the sharp living scent of an animal. This was something else. Inanimate, preserved, deliberately hidden. Ethan stood and retrieved the pry bar from his tool pile. The metal felt cold and familiar in his hands. He wedged the flattened end into the seam Ridge had nudged and applied pressure, slowly listening. The wood resisted, then complained with a long groan like an old man forced to stand after too many years in one position. With a sharp crack, the first plank lifted free. Beneath it was not dirt. It was another layer of wood, newer, cleaner, cut with intention. Ethan's throat tightened. He removed a second plank, then a third. In the center of the revealed section was a recessed iron ring flush with the surface darkened but unmistakably purposeful. Not a farmer's hatch, not a root cellar. This was built to be unseen. Snow drifted past the barn's broken roof slats, thin blades of light cutting through the dusty air. Ridge sat back on his haunches, silent, watchful, his job complete. Ethan wiped his gloves on his coat and hooked 2 fingers through the ring. For a moment he paused. Training asserted itself again, unwelcome but necessary. He listened. The barn creaked softly as it always had. The wind moved through the gaps in the walls. Nothing else. No traps, no hum of machinery, no warning signs except the one already under his feet. He pulled. The hatch opened smoothly, hinges oiled, despite the years above. A breath of air rose from below, cool, dry, clean, utterly foreign to the decay surrounding it. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Ethan flicked on his flashlight. The beam cut cleanly down the steps, revealing solid construction, straight boards, tight seams, no rot. Someone had built this to last. He glanced at Ridge. "Stay close," he said, not because the dog needed instruction, but because the words grounded him. They descended together. The space below opened into a rectangular room that stole the breath from Ethan's lungs. The air was still and tempered, circulated by a small ventilation fan mounted high on one wall, humming almost imperceptibly. Shelves lined the sides, stocked with carefully organized supplies, sealed medical kits, bandages yellowed but intact, IV bags, bottles of antiseptic and painkillers labeled in neat handwriting. A sturdy wooden table stood in the center with a single chair tucked beneath it. On the far wall, illuminated by the flashlight's beam, sat a shortwave radio unit, its dials intact, wires bundled with care and routed cleanly along the wall. Beside it hung several topographical maps of the surrounding region, marked with pins and faint pencil lines. This was not storage. This was a station. Ethan moved slowly, reverently, as if sound itself might break something sacred. Ridge padded after him, nails clicking softly on the concrete floor, then settled at Ethan's side, pressing his flank against the man's leg. Ethan reached for the table, his hand hovering for a moment before touching the stack of leather-bound journals resting there. The leather was worn, smooth edges softened by repeated handling. He opened the first journal. The handwriting was strong, deliberate, economical military print. Dates stretched back decades. At first the entries spoke of weather, of cattle, of isolation. Then the tone shifted. Names appeared, always first names or call signs. Notes about injuries, exhaustion, nightmares. Supplies given, rest taken, departures logged, quietly. Ethan sank into the chair, the flashlight resting on the table, its beam steady. Understanding came in waves, each one heavier than the last. This ranch had not been abandoned. It had been disguised. The decay above ground was camouflage. Beneath it lay purpose. One entry caught his breath entirely. A name he recognized. A situation he had lived through himself. The words blurred not from tears at first, but from the sheer force of recognition. Ridge nudged his knee once gently, as if confirming what they both knew now. Ethan closed the journal and sat back, chest rising and falling slowly. He had come here expecting a grave. Instead, he had found a beating heart, hidden and patient, waiting for someone who could hear it. When he finally stood, he did not feel older. He felt recruited. He extinguished the flashlight and climbed the stairs, Ridge following without hesitation. The hatch closed above them, sealing the hidden room back into silence. In the barn, daylight had shifted, evening pressing close. Snow continued to fall outside, erasing tracks almost as soon as they were made. Ethan stood in the barn's shadowed corner for a long moment, his palm resting on the floor where the signal had been given. He did not yet know what he would do with what he had found. He only knew that he would not walk away from it. The room beneath the barn had the stillness of a held breath, the kind that followed explosions rather than preceded them, and Ethan Cole felt his pulse answer it before his mind caught up. He stood just inside the hidden chamber, flashlight lowered now, letting his eyes adjust to the muted glow of the overhead lamp that someone long ago had wired to life. The walls were paneled with thick, carefully fitted wood, each joint tight, each surface rubbed smooth by hands that had cared about longevity. There were no windows, no concessions to comfort beyond what was necessary. This was a place designed to endure quietly. A ventilation fan murmured high on one wall, steady, and restrained its sound so subtle it blended into the background like breath during sleep. Shelves lined the room in disciplined rows, stocked with supplies that had not been thrown together in panic, but arranged with foresight, sealed medical kits, field dressings, antibiotics long past their printed dates, but stored in conditions that suggested they might still be viable. Stacks of blankets, folded square and precise crates of bottled water and vacuum-packed food. Everything spoke the same language. Someone had expected people to arrive here broken and had prepared accordingly. Ethan's chest tightened, the rhythm of his heart jumping into a cadence he had not felt since the days when sirens had meant seconds mattered. He moved farther inside, boots quiet on the concrete floor, and reached the wooden table at the center. It was scarred by use, its surface nicked and stained, but sturdy. On it lay the journals Ridge had guided him toward, leather-bound and heavy with accumulated years. Ethan picked up the first one again, his hands steadier now than they had been moments before, and opened it with the care one reserved for unexploded ordnance. The handwriting was unmistakable, not just military, but practiced, someone who had learned to communicate clearly under pressure and never unlearned it. The early entries spoke of isolation, of winter storms and livestock losses, of mending fences alone under wide skies. They carried a loneliness Ethan recognized immediately, the kind that came not from lack of people, but from lack of understanding. Then the entries shifted. Names appeared without surnames. Dates became irregular. Notes referenced injuries that had no place on a ranch, shrapnel wounds, fractured ribs, burns. Ethan felt the room tilt slightly as comprehension settled in layers. This was not a hideout. This was a sanctuary. The journals described the Herdman route in blunt terms, stripped of sentimentality. It was a network informal and unmarked, stretching across rural America, places like this ranch that appeared abandoned or unremarkable from the outside. Men arrived here at night, guided by word of mouth and coded radio calls. They stayed for days or weeks, long enough to heal enough to move on, long enough to remember how to sleep without flinching awake. Food was provided, medical care as much as could be managed. No questions asked beyond what was necessary, no judgments rendered. The author wrote of them as cattle once written of in ledgers, not to demean but to keep track to ensure none were lost. Ethan read until his eyes burned, until the room felt too small to hold what he was learning. Ridge remained at his feet, his weight solid and reassuring, his presence a quiet counterbalance to the surge of emotion threatening to break through Ethan's practiced restraint. When Ethan reached the final journal, thinner than the rest, the handwriting wavered, the lines less confident. Age or illness, he guessed, perhaps both. The last entry was brief, its words deliberate despite the trembling script. Cole will understand. He always did. He is old enough now to know that survival isn't weakness, and age isn't failure. This place isn't land. It's a door, and doors need men who know when to open them and when to stand guard. Ethan closed the journal and pressed it against his chest, his breath catching once sharply before he forced it back into control. Tears came then, silent and unannounced, cutting clean lines down his weathered face. Ridge lifted his head and rested it against Ethan's boot, the weight grounding him, reminding him that grief did not mean collapse. Above them, snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in indifferent quiet. Below, something else had fallen away entirely, the belief that he had been left with nothing. He did not stay long in the hidden room that night. Purpose, once ignited, demanded action, not reverence. Ethan secured the hatch, carefully returned the planks to their place, and marked the floor subtly, in a way only he would recognize. By the time he settled back into the truck, night had fully claimed the valley. Sleep came slower than before, but when it did, it was deeper. Morning brought with it the sound of an approaching engine. Ethan was repairing a loose section of fencing near the barn, when Ridge stiffened his ears, snapping toward the road. The German shepherd did not growl, but his posture changed, alert, without aggression. A sedan crested the gravel drive, its dark paint incongruous against the snow and timber. Ethan straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his coat as the car rolled to a stop. Marlene Shaw stepped out first. She looked as she always had, immaculate despite the cold. Her blonde hair pinned neatly back, her wool coat cinched tight at the waist. The mountain air seemed to irritate her. She pulled her collar higher, her expression sharpening as she took in the state of the ranch. Behind her emerged a man Ethan did not recognize. He was in his early 50s, tall and lean, his face narrow with a carefully groomed beard tracing his jaw. His eyes were calculating, scanning the property with professional interest rather than curiosity. He wore boots that had never known mud and a coat too light for the altitude. This was Gordon Pike, though Ethan would not learn his name until later, a developer with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Marlene approached first, her heels sinking slightly into the soft ground. Ethan, she said, her tone a practiced blend of concern and impatience. "I was hoping I'd find you here." Ridge moved closer to Ethan's side, not threatening, simply present. Ethan noted it without comment. "We need to talk." Marlene continued, gesturing toward the man behind her. "This is Gordon. He represents a firm that's very interested in this land." Gordon stepped forward, extending a hand. "Mr. Cole, you've got something special here, even if it doesn't look like it yet." His grip was firm, brief. Ethan returned it with equal brevity. "I'm not selling," Ethan said simply. The words hung in the cold air, unexpected in their finality. Marlene blinked. "Ethan, don't be unreasonable. Look at this place. You can't fix it. You're not..." She stopped herself, lips pressing thin. This is a chance, a good one. Gordon cleared his throat, adopting a tone meant to soothe. We're offering fair market value, enough to give you security, retirement. Ethan glanced toward the barn, toward the hidden heart beneath it. Retirement. The word felt foreign, ill-fitting. He thought of the men described in the journals of nights spent keeping watch so others could sleep. He thought of ridge of signals under floorboards, of doors left waiting. This ranch isn't a property, Ethan said quietly. It's a post. And I'm not done standing it. Marlene's frustration flared, coloring her cheeks. You're being stubborn. You always were. This isn't some heroic stand, Ethan. It's denial. Ethan met her gaze steadily. No, this is duty. Silence followed, broken only by the wind threading through the pines. Gordon glanced at Marlene, his smile tightening. We can revisit this, he said, already retreating. Time has a way of clarifying things. The sedan departed, tires crunching against gravel, leaving behind a plume of dust that settled slowly back into snow. Marlene did not look back as she left. Ethan exhaled long and controlled. The encounter left him shaken not by doubt but by confirmation. Others would come, pressure would mount. The world did not like unanswered doors. That evening, as the sky bruised purple and gray, Ethan returned to the barn. He opened the hatch again, descending into the hidden room with renewed purpose. The radio called to him now, its presence no longer mysterious but expectant. He ran his fingers along the dials, reading labels, tracing connections. His hands remembered this work. Communications had been his specialty once before everything else had unraveled. Ridge lay nearby, watching his tail thumping softly against the floor, not in excitement but in rhythm, as if counting down to something only he sensed. Ethan did not turn the radio on that night. That would come later. First, there was work to be done, repairs above defenses, below preparations for a future that had quietly, insistently arrived. When he finally sealed the hatch and climbed back into the cold night air, the ranch no longer looked like a grave. It looked like a gate. Late afternoon settled over the valley with deceptive calm, the sun hanging low and pale behind a veil of drifting snow, turning the world a muted silver where sound seemed reluctant to travel. Ethan Cole was repairing a section of fence near the barn when Ridge's posture shifted. The German shepherd, now dusted with frost along his thick black and tan coat, had been lying still a few feet away, eyes half closed, conserving energy. In an instant, his ears snapped upright, spine-straightening body angling subtly toward the gravel road. Ridge did not bark. He never did, unless there was no other choice. Instead, he stood and moved closer to Ethan's leg, a quiet declaration of presence. Ethan followed the dog's gaze just as the sound reached him, the low, smooth hum of an engine that did not belong to farm equipment or old pickups. A black sedan emerged through the falling snow, its paint glossy and immaculate, absurdly clean against the battered landscape. It rolled to a stop near Ethan's truck tires, crunching on gravel that had not seen that level of polish in decades. Ethan set the hammer down slowly and straightened joints, protesting breath steady. He already knew who it would be. Marlene Shaw stepped out first. She looked unchanged from the last visit, tall, slender. Her blonde hair pulled back into a neat knot, wool coat tailored sharply enough to resist the cold, if not the altitude. Her face was tight with purpose, lips pressed thin as she surveyed the ranch with open disapproval. Behind her came Gordon Pike, early 50s, lean and angular, his trimmed beard outlining a jaw that had never learned humility. He wore leather gloves unsuited for work and boots that had never known mud. His eyes moved quickly, measuring distances, calculating loss and gain with professional ease. They did not wait to be invited closer. Marlene approached, heels sinking slightly into the soft ground, irritation flashing across her face at the inconvenience of it. "Ethan," she said, voice pitched carefully between concern and authority. We're here to finalize things. Gordon opened a leather portfolio, the snap of its clasp unnaturally loud in the quiet air. He spoke smoothly, confidently, as if rehearsed. We've prepared an offer that reflects the potential of this land. We'll handle demolition, environmental clearing, everything. The barn, the house, none of it is salvageable. We level it, build a resort. Jobs, tourism, progress. He smiled, convinced that word would land. Ethan looked past him toward the barn. Beneath its sagging roof lay the hidden room, the journals, the radio, the quiet promise made to men who would never see a brochure. Ridge stood beside him, legs braced, eyes steady, not aggressive but unmistakably firm. No, Ethan said. The word was calm, unraised, delivered with the same tone he once used to give orders that saved lives. It did not invite discussion. Marlene stared at him, disbelief flickering across her face. Ethan, don't be stubborn. You're 55. You can't keep doing this, sleeping in trucks, fixing ruins. This is me, helping you. Take the money. Live. Ethan turned to face her fully. Up close, the years showed in him, creased skin, silver, threaded through his beard, eyes that had seen too much and learned restraint from it. You think this is ruin, he said quietly. You think I'm clinging to scraps, but you don't see what's here. Gordon scoffed softly. With respect, Mr. Cole's sentiment doesn't change economics. Ethan nodded once. You're right. And economics doesn't change duty. He gestured faintly toward the barn. You see land, I see a gate, and I'm the one standing it. Marlene's frustration finally broke through her composure. You can't win this, she snapped. I'll challenge the inheritance. I'll have this place declared uninhabitable. You'll lose everything. Ethan did not flinch. Then I'll lose it standing, he replied. They left shortly after, Gordon already tapping on his phone, Marlene's face rigid as the sedan disappeared back down the road. Ethan felt his hands tremble when the sound was gone, not from fear, but from anger held too long. Ridge leaned against his legs, solid and warm, absorbing the tension as he always did. That night the temperature dropped sharply. Snow fell heavier, thick flakes blurring the boundaries between earth and sky. Ethan descended into the hidden room beneath the barn with purpose he no longer questioned. He checked the ventilation, the supplies, the radio. The equipment was old but well maintained, waiting rather than abandoned. Communications had once been his specialty before injury, and time redirected his path. His fingers remembered the movements, the sequence of switches the patience required. He sat at the table, Ridge settling at his feet, tail thumping softly, once against the concrete. Ethan opened one of the journals again, flipping to a page marked with a faint crease. The call sign was written there, underlined twice. He inhaled slowly and turned to the radio. This is Cattle Gate, he said into the microphone voice, steady. The barn light is on. Static answered him at first. The familiar hiss stretching the silence thin. Ridge's tail tapped again once, twice, a quiet metronome of patience. Ethan adjusted a dial, listening, waiting. Doubt crept in at the edges. Had the network died with the man who built it? Was he too late? Then the static broke. Cattle Gate, a voice crackled through, distorted but unmistakably human. We read you. Welcome back. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, breath leaving him in a slow, shuddering exhale. Another voice followed, then another. A man in North Dakota. A husband and wife in Wyoming, both Air Force veterans. Their signal strong and steady. An older Marine mechanic operating out of a converted garage. The Herdman route was not a memory. It was dormant waiting. The days that followed blurred into purposeful motion. Word traveled quietly the way it always had. Men arrived not with demands, but with tools. They came in old pickups and rusted vans, faces weathered, movements cautious at first. One was Caleb Monroe, early 40s, broad-shouldered with a shaved head and hands scarred by years of carpentry. He spoke little, his humor dry, shaped by a roadside bomb that had taken part of his hearing. Another was Sarah Whitmore, late 30s, tall and lean, her dark hair cut short for practicality, skin pale against the cold. She had been a combat medic, her calm demeanor forged in chaos, eyes kind but guarded. She assessed injuries and structures with the same careful precision. They repaired roofs, replaced rotted boards, reinforced fences. Ridge moved among them like an old foreman, accepting scratches, offering quiet companionship, positioning himself near those who shook at night. Ethan coordinated without raising his voice, assigning tasks, setting rhythms. He slept less but better. For the first time in years, people needed him not for his strength, but for his steadiness. Marlene's challenge arrived in the form of papers, delivered by a courier, legal threats dressed in formal language. Ethan read them once, then set them aside. Caleb glanced over his shoulder and grunted. "Paper war," he said. "Different weapons, same tactics." Sarah nodded. "We'll make it official," she added. "Non-profit status, protect the land." They did. Paperwork was filed, donated labor, documented local support, gathered quietly. The threat receded not with victory but with exhaustion. Marlene withdrew her challenge months later, unwilling to fight a cause that now had witnesses. Winter passed. Spring followed hesitantly, snow melting into mud grass, pushing through stubbornly. A year went by almost unnoticed. On a night when snow returned unexpectedly soft and heavy, a battered sedan crawled up the gravel road. Its engine coughed and died near the fence. A young man stepped out, no more than 23, thin to the point of fragility. His jacket too light, his eyes haunted and darting. He stood uncertainly, breath hitching in the cold. Ridge walked out first, posture relaxed, tail wagging slowly. He sat a few feet away, offering presence without pressure. The young man's shoulders eased just slightly. Ethan followed, stopping at the edge of the porch. He did not ask questions. He did not reach out. He simply spoke, voice calm and clear. "You're in the right place." The young man swallowed hard, tears spilling silently down his cheeks as the snow fell around them. Ethan stood with him, neither rushing nor retreating. The gate was open. Sometimes God does not send miracles with thunder or fire. Sometimes he sends them disguised as worn hands, stubborn hearts, and a loyal dog that refuses to leave your side. Sometimes the miracle is not the ranch, not the shelter, not even the second chance itself, but the moment you realize you were never forgotten, only prepared. In everyday life, many of us feel like Ethan once did. Too old, too tired, too broken. We think our best days are behind us, that the world has quietly moved on without us. But God often works through what the world calls useless. He turns abandoned places into sanctuaries. He turns pain into purpose. And he turns survivors into gatekeepers for others who are still lost. If this story touched your heart, remember, though, you may be someone's safe place without even knowing it. Your presence, your patience, your willingness to stay, that may be the miracle God is using today. May God bless every viewer who feels weary. May he protect those still searching for peace. And may he guide every wounded heart toward a place where the light is still on. If this story spoke to you, please share it with someone who might need hope. Leave a comment to let us know where you're watching from or who you're praying for. And subscribe to the channel so more stories of faith, loyalty, and quiet miracles can reach those who need them most. God bless you. The gate is open.